Hello, hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. Today we are going to be reading Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon, originally published in 1937, and today we are starting with Chapter 7. Reading updates. I finished Lessons in Chemistry, and it's fine. It's a fine book. It's not really doing anything new for me, but nothing like super upset me. It's just very down the middle. I gave it a 2.5 stars. Of like, yeah, it was fine. Um, I don't know. I wasn't I don't think the book was boring, but I was a little bit bored during it. I can see why so many people really liked it, and I can also see why so many people did not like it. I read this book because it was a top choice for debut books in 2022. So, yeah, now. And I am continuing to read The Left Hand of Darkness. I have 84 pages question mark left. But now is where all the action's coming in, so it's very exciting. I did finish the chemistry book, finally. Finally. I mean, I say that like it took me forever to read. It did not take me forever to read. I was just ready to be done with it. I was just ready to be done. That's all. Mm. Okay. Today, Star Maker, Olaf Stapledon. We're starting with chapter 7, and okay, I'm gonna try to be as brief as possible without being overly vague about what happened so far. So we have our main character, which we do not know the name, like we are just the main character, and we're traveling through space to different planets, and we come across Other Earth, and we stay there for a couple years. We befriend somebody, Bavaltu, probably saying the name wrong, and then have decided to travel with Bavaltu to back to our Earth. But on the way, like we're lost, we discover that we also are traveling not only through space but through time, and um, we go to other human-like planets. So we're studying there. Sometimes they only stay for a couple days, sometimes they stay for a couple years, but we're getting the descriptions of these humanoid creatures and their faults almost. And the commentary of each of these faults can very easily be translated to commentary of the faults of actual Earth. So that's what's happening right now. I think the last place that we went, I think, were they ships? I think they were sentient ships. Nautiloids, I think. I hope we get to go to Vulcan. Live long and prosper, my friend. Okay. I think that's it. And a lot of these chapters and parts of chapters, I like to summarize generally. Um but it is just a little bit different because it is, philosophy and commentary and those types of things instead of plot based, which I think I've talked about before, but we're gonna try it anyway. Let's do it. Let me try crisscross applesauce with my big fluffy slippers. See if it works. All right. Chapter 7. More Worlds. Part 1. A symbiotic race. On certain large planets, whose climates, owing to the proximity of a violent sun, were very much hotter than our tropics, we sometimes found an intelligent fish-like race. It was bewildering to us to discover that a submarine world could give rise to mentality of human rank, and to that drama of the spirit which we had now so often encountered. The very shallow and sun-drenched oceans of these great planets provided an immense diversity of habitats and a great wealth of living things. Green vegetation, which could be classified as tropical, subtropical, temperate, and arctic, basked on the bright ocean floors. There were submarine prairies and forests. In some regions, the giant weeds stretched from the sea bottom to the waves. In these jungles of blue and blinding light of the sun was reduced almost to darkness. Immense coral-like growths, honeycombed with passages and swarming with all manner of live things, lifted their spires and turrets to the surface. Innumerable kinds of fish-like creatures of all sizes, from sprat to whale, inhabited the many levels of the waters, some gliding on the bottom, some daring an occasional leap into the torrid air. In the deepest and darkest regions, hosts of sea monsters, eyeless or luminous, browsed on the ceaseless rain of corpses, which sank from the upper levels. Over their deep world lay other worlds of increasing brightness and color, where gaudy populations basked, browsed, stalked, or hunted with arrowy flight. Intelligence in these planets was generally achieved by some unimposing social creature, neither fish nor octopus nor crustacean, but something of all three. It would be equipped with manipulatory tentacles, keen eyes, and subtle brain. It would make nests of weed in the crevices of the coral, or build strongholds of coral masonry. In time would appear traps, weapons, tools, submarine agriculture, the blossoming of primitive art, the ritual of primitive religion. Then would follow the typical fluctuating advance of the spirit from barbarism to civilization. One of these submarine worlds was exceptionally interesting. Early in the life of our galaxy, when few of the stars had yet condensed from the giant to the solar type, when very few planetary births had yet occurred, a double star and a single star in a congested cluster did actually approach one another, reach fiery filament towards one another, and spawn a planet brood. Of these worlds, one, an immense and very aqueous sphere, produced in time a dominant race which was not a single species, but an intimate symbiotic partnership of two very alien creatures. The one came of a fish-like stock. The other was in appearance something like a crustacean. In form, it was a sort of paddle-footed crab or marine spider. Unlike our crustaceans, it was covered not with a brittle carapace, but with a tough pachydermatous hide. In maturity, this serviceable jerkin was more or less rigid, save at the joints, but in youth it was very pliant to the still expanding brain. This creature lived on the coasts and in the coastal waters of the many islands of the planet. Both species were mentally of human rank, though each had specific temperament and ability. In primitive times, each had attained by its own route and in its own hemisphere of the great aqueous planet to what might be called the last stage of the subhuman mentality. The two species had then come into contact and had grappled desperately. Their battleground was the shallow coastal water. The crustaceans, though crudely amphibian, could not spend long under the sea. The fish could not emerge from it. The two races did not seriously compete with one another in economic life, for the fish were mainly vegetarian, crustaceans mainly carnivorous, yet neither could tolerate the presence of the other. Both were sufficiently human, to be aware of one another as rival aristocrats in a subhuman world, but neither was human enough to realize that for each race, the way of life lay in cooperation with the other. The fish-like creatures, which I shall call ichthyoids, had speed and range of travel. They had also the security of bulk. The crab-like or spider-like crustaceans, which I shall call arachnoids, had greater manual dexterity and had also access to the dry land. Cooperation would have been very beneficial to both species, for one of the staple foods of the arachnoids was parasitic to the ichthyoids. In spite of the possibility of mutual aid, the two races strove to exterminate one another, and almost succeeded. After an age of blind mutual slaughter, certain of the less pugnacious and more flexible varieties of the two species gradually discovered profit in fraternization with the enemy. This was the beginning of a very remarkable partnership. Soon the arachnoids took to riding on the backs of the swift ichthyoids, and thus gained access to more remote hunting grounds. As the epochs passed, the two species molded one another to form a well-integrated union. The little arachnoid, no bigger than a chimpanzee, rode in a snug hollow behind the great fish's skull, his back being streamlined with the contours of the larger creature. The tentacles of the ichthyoid were specialized for large-scale manipulation, those of the arachnoid for minute work. A biochemical interdependence also evolved. Through a membrane in the ichthyoid's pouch, an exchange of endocrine products took place. This mechanism enabled the arachnoid to become fully aquatic. So long as it had frequent contact with its host, it could stay underwater for any length of time and descend to any depth. A striking mental adaptation also occurred in the two species. The ichthyoids became, on the whole, more introvert, the arachnoids more extrovert. Up to puberty, the young of both species were free-living individuals, but as their symbiotic organization developed, each sought out a partner of the opposite species. The union which followed was lifelong and was interrupted only by brief sexual matings. The symbiosis itself constituted a kind of contrapunctal sexuality, but a sexuality that was purely mental, since, of course, for copulation and reproduction, each individual had to seek out a partner belonging to his or her own species. We found, however, that even the symbiotic partnership consisted invariably of a male of one species and a female of the other, and the male, whichever his species, behaved with parental devotion to the young of his symbiotic partner. I have not space to describe the extraordinary mental reciprocity of these strange couples. I can only say that, though in sensory equipment and in temperament the two species were very different, and though in abnormal cases tragic conflicts did occur, the ordinary partnership was at once more intimate than human marriage and far more enlarging to the individual than any friendship between members of distinct human races. At certain stages of the growth of civilization, malicious minds had attempted to arouse widespread interspecific conflict, and had met with temporary success. But the trouble seldom went as deep even as our sex war, so necessary was each species to the other. Both had contributed equally to the culture of their world, though not equally at all times. In creative work, Of every kind, one of the partners provided most of the originality, the other most of the criticism and restraint. Work in which one partner was entirely passive or rare. Starting to suspect that Olaf Stapledon is a sailor or something. Yes, like extremely well done descriptions of humanoid creatures. Yes, loves to talk about how these animal people do it. Loves it. So it's his favorite thing to do. Yes, I think you're right. I think you're totally right. Work in which one partner was entirely passive was rare. Books, or rather scrolls, which were made from pulped seaweed, were nearly always signed by couples. On the whole, the arachnoid partners dominated in manual skill, experimental science, the plastic arts, the practical social organization. The ichthyoid partners excelled in theoretical work, in literary arts, in the surprisingly developed music of that submarine world, and in the more mystical kinds of religion. This generalization, however, should not be interpreted very strictly. The symbiotic relationship seems to have given the dual race a far greater mental flexibility than ours, and a quicker aptitude for community. It passed rapidly through the phase of intertribal strife, during which the nomadic shawls of symbiotic couples harried one another like hosts of submarine cavalry. For the arachnoids, riding their ichthyoid mates, attacked the enemy with bone spears and swords, while their mounts wrestled with powerful tentacles. By the phase of tribal warfare was remarkably brief. When a settled mode of life was attained, along with submarine agricultural and coral-built cities, strife between leagues of cities was the exception, not the rule. Aided, no doubt, by its great mobility and ease of communication, the dual race soon built up a world-wide and unarmed federation of cities. The learned also with wonder. We learned also with wonder that at the height of the pre-mechanical civilization of this planet, when in our worlds the cleavage into masters and economic slaves would already have become serious, the communal spirit of the city triumphed over all individualistic enterprise. Very soon this world became a tissue of interdependent but independent municipal communes. At this time it seemed that social strife had vanished forever, but the most serious crisis of the race was still to come. The submarine environment offered the symbiotic race no great possibilities of advancement. All sources of wealth had been tapped and regularized. Population was maintained at an optimum size for the joyful working of the world. The social order was satisfactory to all classes and seemed unlikely to change. Individual lives were full and varied. Culture, founded on a great tradition, was now concerned entirely with detailed exploration of the great fields of thought that had long ago been pioneered by the revered ancestors under direct inspiration, it was said, of the symbiotic deity. Our friends in this submarine world, our mental hosts, looked back on this age from their own more turbulent epoch, sometimes with yearning, but often with horror, for in retrospect it seemed to them to display the first faint signs of racial decay. So perfectly did the race fit its unchanging environment that intelligence and acuity were already ceasing to be precarious, and might soon begin to fade. But presently it appeared that fate had decreed otherwise. In a submarine world, the possibility of obtaining mechanical power was remote, but the arachnoids, it will be remembered, were able to live out of the water. In the epochs before the symbiosis, their ancestors had periodically emerged upon the islands for courtship, parenthood, and the pursuit of prey. Since those days, the air-breathing capacity had declined, but it had never been entirely lost. Every arachnoid still emerged for sexual mating, and also for certain ritual gymnastic exercises. Like the Olympics, right? It was in this latter connection that the great discovery was made, which changed the course of history. At a certain tournament, the friction of stone weapons clashing against one another produced sparks and fire among the sun-scorched grasses. In startlingly quick succession came smelting, the steam engine, the electric current. Power was obtained first from the combustion of a sort of peat formed on the coasts by congested marine vegetation, later from the constant and violent winds, later still from photochemical light traps, which absorbed the sun's lavish radiation. These inventions were, of course, the work of arachnoids. The ichthyoids, though they still played a great part in the systematization, there we go, of knowledge, were debarred from the great practical work of scientific experiment and mechanical invention above the seas. Soon the arachnoids were running electrical cables from the island power stations to the submarine cities. In this work, at least, the ichthyoids could take part, but their part was necessarily subordinate, not only in experience of electrical engineering, but also in native practical ability that were eclipsed by the arachnoid partners. For a couple of centuries or more, the two species continued to cooperate, though with increasing strain. Artificial lighting, mechanical transport of goods on the ocean floor, and large-scale manufacture produced an immense increase in the amenities of life in the submarine cities. The islands were crowded with buildings devoted to science and industry. Physics, chemistry, and biology made great progress. Astronomers began to map the galaxy. They also discovered that the neighboring planet offered wonderful opportunities for settlement by arachnoids, who might, without great difficulty, it was hoped, be conditioned to the alien climate, and to divorce from their symbiotic partners. The first attempts at rocket flight were leading to mingled tragedy and success. The dictorate of extramarine activities demanded a much increased arachnoid population. Inevitably, there arose a conflict between the two species, and in the mind of every individual of either species. It was at the height of this conflict, and in the spiritual crisis in virtue of which these beings were accessible to us in our novitiate stage, that we first entered this world. The ichthyoids had not yet succumbed biologically to their inferior position, but psychologically they were already showing signs of deep mental decay. A profound disheartenment and lassitude attacked them, like that which so often undermines our primitive races when they find themselves struggling in the flood of European civilization. But since, in the case of the symbiotics, the relation between the two races was extremely intimate, far more so than that between the most intimate human beings, the plight of the ichthyoids deeply affected the arachnoids. And in the minds of the ichthyoids, the triumph of their partners was for long a source of mingled distress and exultation. Every individual of both species was torn between conflicting motives. While every healthy arachnoid longed to take part in the adventurous new life, he or she longed also, through sheer affection and symbiotic entanglement, to assist his or her ichthyoid mate to have an equal share in that life. Further, all arachnoids were aware of subtle dependence on their mates, a dependence at once physiological and psychological. It was the ichthyoids who most contributed to the mental symbiosis, the power of self-knowledge and mutual insight, and the contemplation which is so necessary to keep action sweet and sane. That this was evident from the fact that already among the arachnoids, internecine strife had appeared. Island tended to compete with island, and one great industrial organization with another. I could not help remarking that if this deep cleavage of interest had occurred on my own planet, say between our two sexes, the favored sex would have single-mindedly trampled the other into servitude. Such a victory on the part of the arachnoids did indeed nearly occur. More and more partnerships were dissolved, each member attempting by means of drugs to supply his or her system with the chemicals normally provided by the symbiosis. For mental dependence, however, there was no substitute, and the divorced partners were subject to serious mental disorders, either subtle or flagrant. Nevertheless, there grew up a large population capable of living after a fashion without the symbiotic intercourse. Strife now took a violent turn. The intransigence of both species attacked one another and stirred up trouble among the moderates. There followed a period of desperate and confused warfare. On each side, a small and hated minority advocated a modernized symbiosis, in which each species should be able to contribute to the common life even in a mechanized civilization. Many of these reformers were martyred for their faith. Victory would, in the long run, have gone to the arachnoids, for they controlled the source of power. But it soon appeared that the attempt to break the symbiotic bond was not as successful as it had seemed. Even in actual warfare, commanders were unable to prevent widespread fraternization between the opposed forces. Members of dissolved partnerships would furtively meet to snatch a few hours or moments of each other's company. Widowed or deserted individuals of each species would timidly but hungrily venture toward the enemy's camps in search of new mates. Whole companies would surrender for the same purpose. The arachnoids suffered more from neuroses than from the weapons of the enemy. On the islands, moreover, civil wars and social revolutions made the manufacture of munitions almost impossible. The most resolute faction of the arachnoids now attempted to bring the struggle to an end by poisoning the ocean. The island, in turn, were poisoned by the millions of decaying corpses that rose to the sea's surface and were cast up on the shores. Poison, plague, and above all, neuroses brought war to a standstill, civilization to ruin, and the two species almost to extinction. The deserted skyscrapers that crowded the islands began to crumble into heaps of wreckage. The submarine cities were invaded by the submarine jungle and by shark-like subhuman ichthyoids of many species. The delicate tissue of knowledge began to disintegrate. Oh, excuse me. The delicate tissue of knowledge began to disintegrate into fragments of superstition. Now at last came the opportunity of those who advocated a modernized symbiosis. With difficulty, they had maintained a secret existence and their individual partnership in the more remote and inhospitable regions of the planet. They now came boldly forth to spread their gospel among the unhappy remnants of the world's population. There was a rage of interspecific mating and remating. Primitive submarine agriculture and hunting maintained the scattered peoples, while a few of the coral cities were cleared and rebuilt, and the instruments of a lean but hopeful civilization were refashioned. This was a temporary civilization, without mechanical power, but one which promised itself great adventures in the upper world as soon as it had established the basic principles of the reformed symbiosis. To us, it seemed that such an enterprise was doomed to failure. So clear was it that the future lay with a terrestrial rather than a marine creature. But we were mistaken. I must not tell in detail of the heroic struggle by which the race refashioned its symbiotic nature to suit the career that lay before it. The first stage was the reinstatement of power stations on the island and the careful reorganization of a purely submarine society equipped with power. But this reconstruction would have been useless had it not been accompanied by a very careful study of the physical and mental relations of the two species. The symbiosis had to be strengthened so that interspecific strife should in future be impossible. By means of chemical treatment in infancy, the two kinds of organism were made more interdependent and in partnership more hardy. By a special psychological ritual, a sort of mutual hypnosis, all newly joined partners were henceforth brought into indissoluble mental reciprocity. This interspecific communion, which every individual knew in immediate domestic experience, became in time the basic experience of all culture and religion. The symbiotic deity, which figured in all the primitive mythologies, was reinstated as a symbol of the dual personality of the universe, a dualism, it was said, of creativity and wisdom, unified as the divine spirit of love. The one reasonable goal of social life was affirmed to be the creation of a world of awakened, of sensitive, intelligent, and mutually understanding personalities, banded together for the common purpose of exploring the universe and developing the human spirit's manifold potentialities. Imperceptibly, the young were led to discover for themselves this goal. Gradually and very cautiously, all the industrial operations and scientific researchers of an earlier age were repeated, but with a difference. Industry was subordinated to the conscious social goal. Science, formerly the slave of industry, became the free colleague of wisdom. Once more the islands were crowded with buildings and with eager arachnoid workers, but all the shallow coastal waters were filled with a vast honeycomb of dwelling houses, where the symbiotic partners took rest and refreshment with their mates. In the ocean depths, the old cities were turned into schools, universities, museums, temples, palaces of art, and of pleasure. There the young of both kinds grew up together. There the full grown of both species met constantly for recreation and stimulation. There, while the arachnoids were busy on the islands, the ichthyoids performed their work of education and of refashioning the whole theoretical culture of the world. For it was known clearly by now that in this field their temperament and talents could make a vital contribution to the common life. Thus, literature, philosophy, and non-scientific education were carried out chiefly in the ocean, while on the islands, industry, scientific inquiry, and the plastic arts were more prominent. Perhaps, in spite of the close union of each couple, this strange division of labor would have led in time to renewed conflict, had it not been for two new discoveries. One was the development of telepathy. Several centuries after the age of war, it was found possible to establish full telepathic intercourse between the two members of each couple. In time, this intercourse was extended to include the whole dual race. The first result of this change was a great increase in the facility of communication between individuals all over the world, and therewith a great increase in mutual understanding and in unity of social purpose. But before we lost touch with this rapidly advancing race, we had evidence of a much more far-reaching effect of universal telepathy. Sometimes, so we were told, telepathic communion of the whole race caused something like the fragmentary awakening of a communal world mind in which all individuals participated. The second great innovation of the race was due to genetic research. The arachnoids, who had to remain capable of active life on dry land and on a massive planet, could not achieve any great improvement in brain weight and complexity. But the ichthyoids, who were already large and were buoyed up by the water, were not subject to this limitation. After long and often disastrous experiment of a race of super ichthyoids was produced. In time, the whole ichthyoid population came to consist of these creatures. Meanwhile, the arachnoids, who were by now exploring and colonizing other planets of their solar system, were genetically improved not in respect of general brain complexity, but in those special brain centers which afforded telepathic intercourse. Thus, in spite of their simpler brain structure, they were able to maintain full telepathic community, even with their big-brained mates far away in the ocean on... Oh, I lost my spot. Oh no. To maintain... Oh, here we go. Apologies, we're going to start that sentence over. Thus, in spite of their simpler brain structure, they were able to maintain full telepathic community, even with their big-brained mates far away in the oceans of the mother planet. The simple brains and the complex brains formed now a single system in which each unit, however simple its own contribution, was sensitive to the whole. It was at this point, when the original ichthyoid race had given place to the super ichthyoids, that we finally lost touch. The experience of the dual race passed completely beyond our comprehension. At a much later stage on our adventure, we came upon them again, and on a higher plane of being. They were by then already engaged upon the vast common enterprise which, as I shall tell, was undertaken by the Galactic Society of Worlds. At this time, the symbiotic race consisted of an immense host of arachnoid adventurers scattered over many planets and a company of some 50,000 million super ichthyoids living a life of natatory delight and intense mental activity in the ocean of their great native world. Even at this stage, physical contact between the symbiotic partners had to be maintained, though at long intervals. There was a constant stream of spaceships between the colonies and the mother world. The ichthyoids, together with their teeming colleagues on a score of planets, supported a racial mind, though the thread of the common experience were spun by the whole symbiotic race. They were woven into a simple web by the ichthyoids alone in their primeval oceanic home, to be shared by all members of both races. That is the end of part 1. Thank you so much for the hydrate. Thank you, thank you. That was a long, part. Like 80%. We are 42%. 42%. But I don't know how many notes are at the end. Let me see if there is like a section for notes. There is. So there's 16 chapters, and the 16th chapter is an epilogue, and then there's like a bunch of notes at the end. And we are on chapter 7. So almost halfway. Not bad. Not too shabby. I'm blessed you did DNF. You've been struggling after the first people. Yeah. It's a lot. It is interesting. It's an interesting idea to be able to go to these worlds and see their evolution, like from start to finish for some of them, and seeing like their flaws and like being able to pinpoint like what they did wrong or where they went wrong or like whatever it is, like what led to their demise. And I just think it's interesting. I thought it was too, because I felt like it was like under 200 pages. If I'm still into it, I am not mad. I'm not mad. I'm good to keep going. Going. I'm not mad. I feel like it's very heavy on the yes, the commentary, but if you're not like really like paying attention, then it's very vibes. Like there's a lot of vibes going along, if that makes sense. You're interested in some later stuff, yes. You know about what's coming up. Okay, interesting. I mean, we'll keep going. We'll keep going. It's not a problem at all. Let's do it. Let me have one more sip. It does seem like a lot of space is being taken up by the different worlds that they're visiting. Okay, but it looks like the next chapter is not about that. So that might be good. At least from the chapter title. You request a recap? Yeah. Okay, so we have two races and they intermix with each other, but just for pleasure because like they can't produce with the other race, and their relationship, as the title, as their like as the section was suggested, is very symbiotic. So they're very much like yin and yang, like one side that can't do something, the other one can. And so like they work together really, really well. And then there comes a part when they realize that maybe they don't need to work together. Maybe they can just do this and not need this sort of a thing. And that is where they have fallen apart. But they do have the ability for telepathy, so they're able to communicate through telepathy, which is kind of nice. Um, I don't know if I would like that though. I don't know if I want telepathy. Well, I do, but I don't. You know? I guess I don't want to be able to read people's minds, but I would like to be able to speak to people without having to like talk, if that makes sense. Maybe. All right. Part 2. Composite beings. Sometimes in the course of our adventure, we came upon worlds inhabited by intelligent beings, whose developed personality was an expression not of a single individual organism, but of a group of organisms. Yes, like when you read a book out loud for 3 hours. Yes. In most cases, this state of affairs had arisen through the necessity of combining intelligence with lightness of the individual body. A large planet, rather close to its sun, or swayed by a very large satellite, would be swept by great ocean tides. Vast areas of its surface would be periodically submerged and exposed. In such a world, flight was very desirable, but owing to the strength of gravitational, only a small creature, a relatively small mass of molecules, could fly. A brain large enough for complex human activity could not have been lifted. In such worlds, the organic basis of intelligence was often a swarm of avian creatures no bigger than sparrows. A host of individual bodies were possessed together by a single individual mind of human rank. The body of this mind was multiple, but the mind itself was almost as firmly knit as the mind of a man. As flocks of dunlin or redshank stream and wheel and soar and quiver over our estuaries, so above the great tide-flooded, cultivated regions of these worlds, the animated clouds of avians maneuvered, each cloud a single center of consciousness. Presently, like our own winged waders, the little avians would settle the huge volume of the cloud, shrinking to a mere film upon the ground, a sort of precipitate along the fringe of the receding tide. Life in these worlds was rhythmically divided by the tides. During the nocturnal tides, the bird clouds all swept on the waves. During the daytime tides, they indulged in aerial sports and religious exercises. But twice a day, when the land was dry, they cultivated the drenched ooze, or carried out in their cities of concrete cells all the operations of industry and culture. It was interesting to us to see how ingeniously, before the tide's return, all the instruments of civilization were sealed from the ravages of the water. We supposed at first that the mental unity of these avians was telepathic, but in fact it was not. It was based on the unity of a complex electromagnetic field, in fact, on radio waves permeating the whole group. Radio, transmitted and received by every individual organism, corresponded to the chemical nerve current which maintains the unity of the human nervous system. Each brain reverberated with the ethereal rhythms of its environment, and each contributed its own peculiar theme to the complex pattern of the whole. So long as the flock was within a volume of about a cubic mile, the individuals were mentally unified, each serving as a specialized center in the common brain. But if some were separated from the flock, as sometimes happened in stormy weather, they lost mental contact and became separate minds of very low order. In fact, each degenerated for the time being into a very small, instinctive animal or a system of reflexes set wholly for the task of restoring contact with the flock. It may easily be imagined that the mental life of these composite beings was very different from anything which we had yet encountered. Different, and yet the same. Like a man, the bird cloud was incapable of anger and fear, hunger and sexual hunger, personal love and all the passions of the herd. But the medium of these experiences was so different from anything known to us that we found great difficulty in recognizing them. Sex, for instance, was very perplexing. Each cloud was bisexual, having some hundreds of specialized male and female avian units, indifferent to one another, but very responsive to the presence of other bird clouds. We found that in these strange multiple beings, the delight and shame of bodily contact were obtained not only through actual sexual union of the specialized sexual members, but, with the most exquisite subtlety, in the aerial interfusion by two flying clouds during the performance of courtship gymnastics in the air. I was thinking the same thing, Captain Hardship. Here we go. But now it's bird clouds. All right, Stapledon. More important for us than this superficial likeness to ourselves was an underlying parity of mental rank. Indeed, we should not have gained access to them at all had it not been for the essential similarity of their evolutionary stage with that which we knew so well in our own worlds. For each one of these mobile-minded clouds of little birds was in fact an individual, approximately of our own spiritual order. Indeed, a very human thing, torn between the beast and the angel, incapable of ecstasies of love and hate toward another bird clouds, capable of wisdom and folly, and the whole gamut of human passions from swinishness to ecstatic contemplation, probing as best we could beyond the formal similarity of spirit which gave us access to the bird clouds. We discovered painfully how to see with a million eyes at once, how to feel the texture of the atmosphere with a million wings. We learned to interpret the composite percepts of mudflats and marshes and great agricultural regions, irrigated twice daily by the tide. We admired the great tide-driven turbines and the system of electric transport of freight. We discovered that the forests of high concrete poles or minarets and platforms on stilts, which stood in the shallowest of the tidal areas, were nurseries where the young were tended till they could fly. Little by little, we learned to understand something of the alien thought of these strange beings, which was, in its detailed texture, so different from our own, yet in general pattern the significance so similar. Time presses, and I must not try even to sketch the immense complexity of the most developed of these worlds. So much else has still to be told. I will say only that, since the individuality of these bird clouds was more precarious than human individuality, it was apt to be better understood and more justly valued. The constant danger of the bird clouds was physical and mental disintegration. Consequently, the ideal of the coherent self was very prominent in all their cultures. On the other hand, the danger that the self of the bird cloud would be psychically invaded and violated by its neighbors, much as one radio station may interfere with another, forced these beings to guard more carefully than ourselves against the temptations of the herd, against drowning the individual cloud's self in the mob of clouds. But again, just because this danger was effectively guarded against, the ideal of the worldwide community developed without any life and death struggle with mystical tribalisms, such as we know too well. Instead, the struggle was simply between individualism and the twin ideals of the world community and the world mind. At the time of our visit, worldwide conflict was already breaking out between the two parties in every region of the planet. The individualists were stronger in one hemisphere and were slaughtering all adherents of the world mind ideal and mustering their forces for attack on the other hemisphere. Here the party of the world mind dominated, not by weapons, but by sheer radio bombardment, so to speak. The pattern of ethereal undulations issuing from the party imposed itself by sheer force on all recalcitrants. All rebels were either mentally disintegrated by radio bombardment or were absorbed intact into the communal radio system. The war which ensued was to us astounding. The individualists used artillery and poison gas. The party of the world mind used these weapons far less than the radio, which they, but not their enemies, could operate with irresistible effect. So greatly was the radio system strengthened, and so adapted to the psychological receptivity of the avian units, that before the individuals had done serious harm, they found themselves engulfed, so to speak, in an overwhelming torrent of radio stimulation. Their individuality crumbled away. The avian units that made up their composite bodies were either destroyed, if they were specialized for war, or reorganized into new clouds, loyal to the world mind. Shortly after the defeat of the individualists, we lost touch with this race. The experience and the social problems of the young world mind were incomprehensible to us. Not till a much later stage of our adventure did we regain contact with it. Others of the world inhabited by races of bird clouds were less fortunate. Most, through one cause or another, came to grief. And many of them the stresses of industrialism or of social unrest brought about a plague of insanity or disintegration of the individual into a swarm of mere reflex animals. These miserable little creatures, which had not the power of independent intelligent behavior, were slaughtered in myriads by natural forces and beasts of prey. Presently, the stage was clear for some worm or amoeba to re-inaugurate the great adventure of biological evolution toward the human plane. In the course of our exploration, we came upon other types of composite individuals. For instance, we found that very large, dry planets were sometimes inhabited by populations of insect-like creatures, each of whose swarms or nests was the multiple body of a single mind. In that hive mind. So what I'm gathering so far in this part is the idea of collectivism versus individualism. Yep. These planets were so large that no mobile organism could be bigger than a beetle, no flying organism bigger than an ant. In the intelligent swarms that fulfilled the part of men in these worlds, the microscopic brains of the insect-like units were specialized for microscopic functions within the group, much as the members of an ant's nest are specialized for working, fighting, reproduction, and so on. All were mobile, but each class of the units fulfilled special neurological functions in the life of the whole. In fact, they acted as though they were special types of cells in a nervous system. In these worlds, as in the worlds of the bird clouds, we had to accustom ourselves to the unified awareness of a huge swarm of units. With innumerable hurrying feet, we crept along Lilliputian concrete passages. With innumerable manipulatory antennae, we took part in obscure industrial or agricultural operations, or in the navigation of toy ships on the canals and lakes of these flat worlds. Through innumerable, many-faceted eyes, we surveyed the plains of moss-like vegetation, or studied the stars with minute telescopes and spectroscopes. So perfectly organized was the life of the mind swarm that all routine activities of industry and agriculture had become, from the point of view of the swarm's mind, unconscious, like the digestive processes of a human being. The little insectoid units themselves carried on these operations unconsciously, though without understanding their significance. But the mind of the swarm had lost the power of attending to them. Its concern was almost wholly with such activities as called for unified conscience control, in fact, with practical and theoretical invention of all kinds, and with physical and mental exploration. At the time of our visit to the most striking of these insectoid worlds, the world population consisted of many great nations of swarms. Each individual swarm had its own nest, its Lilliputian city, an area of about an acre, in which the ground was honeycombed to a depth of 2 feet with chambers and passages. The surrounding district was devoted to the cultivation of the moss-like food plants. As the swarm increased in size, colonies might be founded beyond the range of the physiological radio system of the parent swarm. Thus arose a new group individuals. But neither in this race nor in the race of bird clouds was there anything corresponding to our successive generations of individual minds. Within the minded group, the insectoid units were ever dying off and giving place to fresh units, but the mind of the group was potentially immortal. The units succeeded one after one another. The group self persisted. Its memory reached back past countless generations of units, fading as it receded, and finally losing itself in that archaic time when the human was emerging from the subhuman. Thus the civilized swarms had vague and fragmentary memories of every historical period. Civilization had turned the old disorderly warrens into carefully planned subterranean cities, had turned the old irrigation channels into a widespread mesh of waterways for the transport of freight from district to district, had introduced mechanical power based on the combustion of vegetable matter, had smelted metals from outcrops and alluvial deposits, had produced the extraordinary tissue of minute, almost microscopic machinery which had so greatly improved the comfort and health of the more advanced regions, had produced also myriads of tiny vehicles corresponding to our tractors, trains, ships, had created class distinctions between those group individuals that remained primarily agricultural, those that were mainly industrial, and those that specialized in intelligent coordination of their country's activities. These last became, in time, the bureaucratic tyrants of the country. Owing to the great size of the planet and the extreme difficulty of long-distance travel by creatures so small as the insectoid units, civilization had developed independently in a score of insulated regions, and when at last they came in contact, many of them were already highly industrialized and equipped with the most modern weapons. The reader may easily imagine what happened when races that were in most cases biologically of different species, and anyhow were completely alien in customs, thought, and ideals, suddenly found themselves in contact and in conflict. It would be wearisome to describe the insane warfare which ensued, but it is of interest to note that we, the telepathic visitors from regions remote in time and space, could communicate with these warring hosts more easily than one host could communicate with another. And through this power, we were actually able to play an important role in the history of this world. Indeed, it was probably through our mediation that these races were saved from mutual destruction. Taking up positions in key mines on each side of the conflict, we patiently induced in our host some insight into the mentality of the enemy. And since each of these races had already passed far beyond the level of sociality known on the earth, since in relation to the life of his own race, a swarm mind was capable of true community, the realization of the enemy as being not monstrous, but essentially humane, was enough to annihilate the will to fight. The key minds on either side, enlightened by divine messengers, heroically preached peace. And though many of them were hastily martyred, their cause triumphed. The races made terms with each other, all save two formidable and culturally rather backward people. These we could not persuade, and as they were by now highly specialized for war, they were a very serious menace. They regarded the new spirit of peace as mere weakness on the part of the enemy, and they were determined to take advantage of it and to conquer the rest of that world. But now we witnessed a drama which to terrestrial men must surely seem incredible. It was possible in this world only because of the high degree of mental lucidity which had already been attained within the bound of each race. The Pacific races had the courage to disarm. In the most spectacular and unmistakable manner, they destroyed their weapons and their munition factories. They took care, too, that these events should be witnessed by enemy swarms that had been taken prisoner. These captives they had freed, bidding them report their experiences to the enemy. In reply, the enemy invaded the nearest of the disarmed countries and set about ruthlessly imposing the military culture upon it by means of propaganda and persecution. But in spite of mass executions and mass torture, the upshot was not what was expected. For though the tyrant races were not appreciably more developed in sociality than Homo sapiens, the victims were far superior. Regression only strengthened the will for passive resistance. Little by little the tyranny began to waver. Then suddenly it collapsed. The invaders withdrew, taking with them the infection of pacifism. In a surprisingly short time, that world became a federation whose members were distinct species. With sadness, I realized that on the earth, though all civilized beings belong to one and the same biological species, such a happy issue of strife is impossible, simply because the capacity for community in the individual mind is still too weak. I wondered, too, whether the tyrant races of insectoids would have had greater success in imposing their culture on the invaded country if there had been a distinct generation of juvenile, malleable swarms for them to educate. When this insectoid world had passed through its crisis, it began to advance so rapidly in social structure and in development of the individual mind that we found increasing difficulty in maintaining contact. At last, we lost touch. But later, when we ourselves had advanced, we were to come upon this world again. Of the other insectoid worlds I shall say nothing, for not one of them was destined to play an important part in the history of the galaxy. To complete the picture of the races in which the individual mind had not a single, physically continuous body, I must refer to a very different and even stranger kind. In this, the individual body is the cloud of the ultramicroscopic subvital units, organized in a common radio system. Of this kind is the race which now inhabits our own planet, Mars. As I have already in another book described these beings and the tragic relations which they will have with our own descendants in the remote future, I shall say no more of them here, save that we did not make contact with them till a much later stage in our adventure, when we had acquired the skill to reach out to beings alien to ourselves in spiritual condition. And that's the end of part 2 of chapter 7. All right, so this one, as I mentioned, in a nutshell, is just collectivism and individualism. And it seems like a lot of these lessons are, like throughout the book, are, yeah, these things are cool to have, but if you have too much of one thing and too little of another, then the balance is offset, and that just completely destroys everything. So I think that's interesting. That's all I have to say about that one. So we saw a couple different planets that had that same ideal, that same theme. All right. Part 3 of chapter 7. Plant men and others. I'm excited for plant men. I'm ready. Before passing on to tell the story of our galaxy as a whole, so far as I can comprehend it, I must mention another and a very alien kind of world. Of this type, we found new examples, and few of these survived into the time when the galactic drama was at its height. But one at least had, or will have, a great influence on the growth of the spirit in that dramatic era. On certain small planets, drenched with light and heat from a near or a great sun, evolution took a very different course from that with which we are familiar. The vegetable and animal functions were not separated into distinct organic types. Every organism was at once animal and vegetable. Yeah, plant men, yeah, worth a detour. I agree. In such worlds, the higher organisms were something like gigantic and mobile herbs, but the violent flood of solar radiation rendered the tempo of their life much more rapid than that of our plants. To say that they looked like herbs is perhaps misleading, for they looked equally like animals. They had a definite number of limbs and a definite form of body, but all their skin was green, or streaked with green, and they bore here or there, according to their species, great masses of foliage. Owing to the slight power of gravitation on these small planets, the plant animals often supported vast superstructures on very slender trunks or limbs. In general, those that were mobile were less generously equipped with leaves than those that were more or less sedentary. In these small, hot worlds, the turbulent circulation of water and atmosphere caused rapid changes in the condition of the ground from day to day. Storm and flood made it very desirable for the organisms of these worlds to be able to move from place to place. Consequently, the early plants, which owing to the wealth of solar radiation could easily store themselves with energy for a life of moderate muscular activity, developed powers of perception and locomotion. Vegetable eyes and ears, vegetable organs of taste, scent, and touch appeared on their stems or foliage. For locomotion, some of them simply withdrew their primitive roots from the ground and crept hither and thither with a kind of caterpillar action. Some spread their foliage and drifted on the wind. From these, in the courses of age, arose true flyers. Meanwhile, the pedestrian species turned some of their roots into muscular legs, 4 or 6, or centipedal. The remaining roots were equipped with boring instruments, which on a new site could rapidly proliferate into the ground. Yet another method of combining locomotion and roots was perhaps more remarkable. The aerial portion of the organism would detach itself from its embedded roots and wander off by land or air to strike root afresh in virgin soil. When the second site was exhausted with creature, When the second site was exhausted, the creature would either go off in search of a third, and so on, or return to its original bed, which by now might have recovered fertility. There, it would attach itself once more to its old dormant roots and wake them into new activity. Many species, of course, developed predatory habits and special organs of offense, such as muscular bows as strong as pythons for construction, or talons, horns, and formidable serrated pincers. In these carnivorous creatures, the spread of foliage was greatly reduced, and all the leaves could be tucked snugly away along the back. In the most specialized beasts of prey, the foliage was atrophied and had only decorative value. It was surprising to see how the environment imposed on these alien creatures forms suggestive of our tigers and wolves, and it was interesting, too, to note how excessive specialization and excessive adaptation to offense or defense ruined species after species, and how, when at length human intelligence appeared, it was achieved by an unimposing and inoffensive creature whose sole gifts were intelligence and sensibility toward the material world and towards its fellows. Before describing the efflorescence of humanity in this kind of world, I must mention one grave problem which faces the evolving life of all small planets, often at an early age. This problem we had already come across on the other Earth. Owing to the weakness of gravitation and the disturbing heat of the sun, the molecules of the atmosphere very easily escape into space. Most small worlds, of course, lose all their air and water long before life can reach the human stage, sometimes even before it can establish itself at all. Others, less small, may be thoroughly equipped with atmosphere in their early phases, but at a much later date, owing to the slow but steady contraction of their orbits, they may become so heated that they can no longer hold down the furiously agitated molecules of their atmosphere. On some of these planets, a great population of living forms develops in early eons, only to be parched and suffocated out of existence through the long-drawn denudation and desiccation of the planet. But in more favorable cases, life is able to adapt itself progressively to the increasingly severe conditions. In some worlds, for instance, a biological mechanism appeared by which the remaining atmosphere was imprisoned within a powerful electromagnetic field generated by the world's living population. In others, the need of atmosphere was done away with altogether. Photosynthesis and the whole metabolism of life were carried on by means of liquids alone. The last dwelling gases were captured in solution, stored in huge tracts of spongy growths among the crowded roots, and covered with an impervious membrane. Both these natural biological methods occurred in one or other of the plant-animal worlds. that reached the human level. I have space only to describe a single example, the most significant of these remarkable worlds. This was one in which all free atmosphere had been lost long before the appearance of intelligence. To enter this world and experience it through the alien senses and alien temperament of its natives was an adventure in some ways more bewildering than any of our earlier explorations. Owing to the complete absence of atmosphere, the sky, even in full sunlight, was black with the blackness of interstellar space, and the stars blazed. Owing to the weakness of gravitation and the absence of the molding action of air and water and frost on the planet's shrinking and wrinkled surface, the landscape, with a mass of fold mountains, primeval and extinct volcanoes, congealed floods, and humps of lava, and craters left by the impact of giant meteors. None of these features had ever been much smoothed by atmospheric and glacial influences. Further, the ever-changing stresses of the planet's crust had shattered many of the mountains into the fantastic forms of icebergs. On our own Earth, where gravity, that tireless hound, pulls down its quarry with so much greater strength, these slender, top-heavy crags and pinnacles could never have stood. Owing to the absence of atmosphere, the exposed surfaces of the rock were blindingly illuminated. The crevices and all the shadows were black as night. Many of the valleys had been turned into reservoirs, seemingly of milk, for the surfaces of these lakes were covered with a deep layer of a white, glutinous substance, to prevent loss by evaporation. Round about clustered the roots of the strange people of this world, like tree stumps where a forest has been felled and cleared. Each stump was sealed with the white glove. Every stretch of soil was in use, and we learned that, though some of this soil was the natural result of past ages of action by air and water, most was artificial. It had been manufactured by many great mining and pulverizing processes. In primitive times, and indeed throughout all pre-human evolution, the competitive struggle for a share of the rare soil of this world of rock had been one of the main spurs of intelligence. The mobile plant men themselves were to be seen by day clustered in the valleys, their foliage spread to the sun. Only by night did we observe them in action, moving over the bare rock or busy with machines and other artificial objects, instruments of their civilization. There were no buildings, no roofed, weatherproof enclosures, for there was no weather, but the plateau and terraces of the rock were crowded with all manner of artifacts unintelligible to us. The typical plant man was an erect organism, like ourselves. On his head he bore a vast crest of green plumes, which could be either folded together in the form of a huge, tight cos lettuce, or spread out to catch the light. 3 many-faceted eyes looked out from under the crest. Beneath these were 3 arm-like manipulatory limbs, green and serpentine, branching at their extremities. The slender trunk, pliable, encased in hard rings which slid into one another at the body, bowed, was divided into 3 legs for locomotion. 2 of the 3 feet were also mouths, which could either draw sap from the root or devour foreign matter. The third was an organ of excretion. The precious excrement was never wasted, but passed through a special junction between the 3rd foot and the root. The feet contained taste organs and also ears, since there was no air. Sound was not propagated above the ground. By day the life of these strange beings was mainly vegetable, by night animal. I am also mostly a vegetable during the day and become active at night. Every morning after the long and frigid night, the whole population swarmed to its broody dormitories. Each individual sought out his own route, fixed himself to it, and stood throughout the torrid day with leaves outspread. Till sunset he slept, not in a dreamless sleep, but in a sort of trance, the meditative and mystical quality of which was to prove in future ages a well of peace for many worlds. While he slept, the currents of sap hastened up and down his trunk, carrying chemicals between roots and leaves, flooding him with a concentrated supply of oxygen, removing the products of past catabolism. When the sun had disappeared once more behind the crags, displaying for a moment a wisp of fiery prominence, he would wake, fold up his leaves, close the passages to his roots, detach himself, and go about the business of civilized life. Night in this world was brighter than moonlight with us, for the stars were unobscured, and several great clusters hung in the night sky. Artificial light, however, was used for delicate operations. Its chief disadvantage was that it tended to send the worker to sleep. I must not try even to sketch the rich and alien social life of these beings. I will only say that here, as elsewhere, we found all the cultural themes known on Earth, but that in this world of mobile plants all was transposed into a strange key, a perplexing mode. Here, as elsewhere, we found a population of individuals deeply concerned with the task of keeping themselves and their society in being. Here we found self-regard, hate, love, the passion of the mob, intellectual curiosity, and so on. And here, as in all the other worlds that we had thus far visited, we found a race in the throes of the great spiritual crisis, which was the crisis familiar to us in our own worlds, and formed the channel by which we had telepathic access to other worlds. But here the crisis had assumed a style different from any that we had yet encountered. We had, in fact, begun to extend our powers of imaginative exploration. Leaving all else unnoticed, I must try to describe this crisis, for it is significant for the understanding of matters which reached far beyond this little world. We did not begin to have insight into the drama of this race till we had learned to appreciate the mental aspect of its dual animal-vegetable nature. Briefly, the mentality of the plant man in every age was an expression of the varying tension between the two sides of their nature, between the active, assertive, objectively inquisitive, and morally positive animal nature and the passive, subjectively contemplative, and devoutly acquiescent vegetable nature. It was, of course, through animal prowess and practical human intelligence that the species had long ago come to dominate its world. But at all times this practical will had been tempered and enriched by a kind of experience which among men is very rare. Every day, throughout the ages, these beings had surrendered their feverish animal nature, not merely to unconscious or dream-racked sleep such as animals know, but to the special kind of awareness which, we learned, belong to plants. Spreading their leaves, they had absorbed directly the essential elixir of life, which animals receive only at second hand in the mangled flesh of their prey. Thus they seemingly maintained immediate physical contact with the source of all cosmical being, and this state, though physical, was also in some sense spiritual. It had a far-reaching effect on all their conduct. If theological language was acceptable, it might well be called a spiritual contact with God. During the busy night time, they went about their affairs as insulated individuals, having no present, immediate experience of their underlying unity, but normally they were always preserved from the worst excesses of individualism by memory of their daytime life. It took us long to understand that their peculiar daytime state did not consist simply in being united as a group mind, whether of tribe or race. Theirs was not the condition of the avian units in the bird cloud, nor yet of the telepathically constituted world minds which, as we were later to discover, had a very great part to play in galactic history. The plant man did not, in his daytime life, come into possession of the precepts and thoughts of this fellow plant man, and thereby waken into a more comprehensive and discriminate awareness of the environment and of the multiple body of the race. On the contrary, he became completely unresponsive to all objective conditions save the flood of sunlight drenching his spread leaves. And this experience afforded him an enduring ecstasy whose quality was almost sexual, an ecstasy in which subject and object seemed to become identical, an ecstasy of subjective union with the obscure source of all finite being. In this state, the plant man could meditate upon his active nighttime life, and could become aware, far more clearly than by day, of the intricacies of his own motives. In this daytime mode, he passed no moral judgments on himself or others. He mentally reviewed every kind of human conduct with detached, contemplative joy as a factor in the universe. But when night came again, bringing the active nocturnal mood, the calm, daytime insight into himself and others was lit with a fire of moral praise and censure. Now, throughout the career of this race, there had been a certain tension between the two basic impulses of its nature. All its finest cultural achievements had been made in times when both had been vigorous and neither predominant. But, as in so many other worlds, the development of natural science and the production of mechanical power from tropical sunlight caused grave mental confusion. The manufacture of innumerable aids to comfort and luxury, the spread of electric railways over the whole world, the development of radio communication, the study of astronomy and mechanistic biochemistry, the urgent demands of war and social revolution. All these influences strengthened the active mentality and weakened the contemplative. The climax came when it was found possible to do away with the daytime sleep altogether. The products of artificial photosynthesis could be rapidly injected into the living body every morning, so that the plant man could spend practically the whole day in active work. Very soon the roots of the peoples were being dug up and used as raw material in manufacture. They were no longer needed for their natural purpose. I must not spend time in describing the hideous plight into which this world now fell. Seemingly, artificial photosynthesis, though it could keep the body vigorous, failed to produce some essential vitamin of the spirit, a disease of robotism, of purely mechanical living, spread throughout the population. There was, of course, a fever of industrial activity. The plantmen careered round their planet in all kinds of mechanically propelled vehicles, decorated themselves with the latest synthetic products, tapped the central volcanic heat for power, expended great ingenuity in destroying one another, and in 1,000 other feverish pursuits pushed on in search of a bliss which ever eluded them. After untold distresses, they began to realize that their whole way of life was alien to their essential plant nature. Leaders and prophets dared to inveigh against mechanization and against the prevalent intellectualistic scientific culture and against artificial photosynthesis. By now, nearly all the roots of the race had been destroyed, but presently biological science was turned to the task of generating, from the few remaining specimens, new roots for all. Little by little, the whole population was able to return to natural photosynthesis. The industrial life of the world vanished like frost in sunlight. In returning to the old alternating life of animal and vegetable, the plantmen, jaded and deranged by the long fever of industrialism, found in their calm daytime experience an overwhelming joy. The misery of their recent life intensified by contrast, the ecstasy of the vegetal experience. The intellectual acuity that their brightest mind had acquired in scientific analysis, combined with the special quality of their revived plant life, to give their whole experience a new lucidity. For a brief period, they reached a plane of spiritual lucidity which was to be an example and a treasure for the future eons of the galaxy. But even the most spiritual life has its temptations. The extravagant fever of industrialism and intellectualism had so subtly poisoned the plantmen that when at last they rebelled against it, they swung too far, falling into the snare of a vegetal life as one-sided as the old animal life had been. Little by little, they gave less and less energy and time to animal pursuits, until at last their nights as well as their days were spent wholly as trees, and the active, exploring, manipulating animal intelligence died in them forever. For a while, the race lived on in an increasingly vague and confused ecstasy of passive union with the universal source of being. So well established and automatic was the age-old biological mechanism for preserving the planet's vital gases in solution that it continued long to function without attention. But industrialism had increased the world population beyond the limits within which the small supply of water and gases could easily fulfill its function. The circulation of material was dangerously rapid. In time, the mechanism was overstrained. Leakages began to appear, and no one repaired them. Little by little, the precious water and other volatile substances escaped from the planet. Little by little, the reservoirs ran dry. The spongy roots were parched, the leaves withered. One by one, the blissful and no longer human inhabitants of that world passed from ecstasy to sickness, despondency, uncomprehending bewilderment, and on to death. But as I shall tell, their achievement was not without effect on the life of our galaxy. Vegetable humanities, if I may so call them, proved to be rather uncommon occurrences. Some of them inhabited worlds of a very curious kind which I have not yet mentioned. As is well known, a small planet close to its sun tends, through the sun's tidal action upon it, to lose its rotation. Its days become longer and longer till at last it presents one face constantly toward its luminary. Not a few planets of this type up and down the galaxy were inhabited, and several of them by vegetable humanities. All these non-diurnal worlds were very inhospitable to life, for one hemisphere was always extravagantly hot, the other extravagantly cold. The illuminated face might reach the temperature of molten lead. On the dark face, however, no substances could retain the liquid state, for the temperature would remain but a degree or two above absolute zero. Between the two hemispheres there would lie a narrow belt, or rather a mere ribbon, which might be called temperate. Here the immense and incendiary light was always partly hidden by the horizon. Along the cooler side of this ribbon, hidden by the murderous rays of the sun's actual disk, but illuminated by his corona, and warmed by the conduction of heat from the sunward ground, life was not invariably impossible. Inhabited worlds of this kind had always reached a fairly high stage of biological evolution long before they had lost their diurnal rotation. As the day lengthened, life was forced to adapt itself to more extreme temperatures of day and night. The poles of these planets, if not too much inclined toward the ecliptic, remained at a fairly constant temperature, and were therefore citadels whence the living forms ventured into less hospitable regions. Many species manage to spread toward the equator by the simple method of burying themselves and hibernating through the day and the night, emerging only for dawn and sunset to lead a furiously active life. As the day lengthened into months, some species, adapted for swift locomotion, simply trekked round the planet, following the sunset and the dawn. Strange it was to see the equatorial and most agile of these species sweeping over the plains in the level sunlight. Their legs were often as tall and slender as a ship's masts. Now and then they would swerve, with long necks extending to snatch some scurrying creature or pluck some bunch of foliage. Such constant and rapid migration would have been impossible in worlds less rich in solar energy. Human intelligence seems never to have been attained in any of these worlds unless it had been attained already, before night and day became excessively long, and the difference of their temperatures excessively great. In worlds where plantmen or other creatures had achieved civilization and science before rotation had become seriously slowed, great efforts were made to cope with the increasing harshness of the environment. Sometimes civilization merely retreated to the poles, abandoning the rest of the planet. Sometimes subterranean settlements were established in other regions, the inhabitants issuing only at dawn and sunset to cultivate the land. Sometimes a system of railways along the parallels of latitude carried a migratory population from one agriculture center to another, following the twilight. Finally, however, when rotation had been entirely lost, a settled civilization would be crowded along the whole length of the stationary girdle between night and day. By this time, if not before, the atmosphere would have been lost too. It can well be imagined that a race struggling to survive in these literally straitened circumstances would not be able to maintain any richness and delicacy of mental life. End of chapter 7. Okay, so I enjoyed the Plant Men. I thought it was super interesting. I liked the details of like during the day they're more plant, and then at night they become more animal. And it's interesting that as they were evolving and developing and they had like an industrial revolution of sorts, they started to devolve. They lost their naturalness. They started going, I don't know, like they weren't able to sustain, I guess. And so they started to develop uh, synthetic means of, like photosynthesis and that sort. And they swung too far into the industrial, and they're like, oh no, we need to correct this. And then they like bypassed where they usually were and then swung too far into being natural again. And so when they left the planet, they were pretty much just trees rather than like plant people or closer to animals. So that's interesting too, like finding that balance. And it seems like there is commentary on not having something that is so highly production or industrialized or manufactured, but finding that balance between manufactured and natural seems to be the case, because originally they did have a balance between like plant and animal, and then they just sort of lost it. Thought they could make it better and ended up making it way worse. Ain't that the way of it? That was a very long chapter. That was all chapter 7, which is absolutely wild. Okay. This chapter is much shorter. Let's do it. Chapter 8. Concerning the Explorers. Vivaltu and I, in company with the increasing band of our fellow explorers, visited many worlds of many strange kinds. In some we spent only a few weeks of the local time, in others we remained for centuries, or skimmed from point to point of history as our interest dictated. Like a swarm of locusts, we would descend upon a new-found world, each of us singling out a suitable host. After a period of observation, long or short, we would leave, to alight again, perhaps, on the same world in another of its age, or to distribute our company among many worlds, far apart in time and in space. This strange life turned me into a very different being from the Englishman who had at a certain date of human history walked at night upon a hill. Not only had my own immediate experience increased far beyond the normal range, but also, by means of a peculiarly intimate union with my fellows, I myself had been, so to speak, multiplied. For in a sense I was now as much Vivaltu and each of my colleagues as I was that Englishman. This change that had come over us deserves to be carefully described, not merely for its intrinsic interest, but also because it afforded us a key for understanding many cosmical beings whose nature would otherwise have been obscure to us. In our new condition, our community was so perfected that the experiences of each were available to all. Thus I, the new I, the Englishman, and similarly each of my colleagues gradually woke into possession of each other's experience, and also into more lucid intelligence. Whether, as experiments, we remained many or became one, I do not know. But I suspect that the question is one of those which can never be truly answered because in the last analysis it is meaningless. In the course of my communal observation of the many worlds, and equally in the course of my introspection of my own communal mental processes, now one and now another individual explorer, and now perhaps a group of explorers, would form the main instrument of attention, affording through their particular nature and experience material for the contemplation of all. Sometimes, when we were exceptionally alert and eager, each awakened into a mode of perception and thought and imagination, and will more lucid than any experiencing known to any of us as individuals. Thus, though each of us became in a sense identical with each of his friends, he also became in a manner a mind of higher order than any of us in isolation. But in this waking, there seemed to be nothing more mysterious in kind than in those many occasions in normal life when the mind delightedly relates together experiences that have hitherto been isolated from one another, or discovers in confused objects a pattern or a significance hitherto unnoticed. It must be supposed that this strange mental community blotted out the personalities of the individual explorer. Human speech has no accurate terms to describe our peculiar relationship. It would be as untrue to say that we had lost our individuality or were dissolved in a communal individuality as to say that we were all the while distinct individuals. Though the pronoun I now applied to us all collectively, the pronoun we also applied to us. In one respect, namely unity of consciousness, we were indeed a single experiencing individual, yet at the same time we were in a very important and delightful manner distinct from one another. Though there was only the single communal I, there was also, so to speak, a manifold and variegated we, an observed company of very diverse personalities, each of whom expressed creatively his own unique contribution to the whole enterprise of cosmical exploration, while all were bound together in a tissue of subtle personal relationships. I am well aware that this account of the matter must seem to my readers self-contradictory, as indeed it does to me. But I can find no other way of expressing the vividly remembered fact that I was at once a particular member of a community and the possessor of the pooled experience of that community. To put the matter somewhat differently, though in respect of our identity of awareness we were a single individual, in respect of our diverse and creative idiosyncrasies, we were distinct persons observable by the common eye. Each one, as the common eye, experienced the whole company of individuals, including his individual self, as a group of actual persons, differing in temperament and private experience. Each one of us experienced all as a real community, bound together by such relations of affection and mutual criticism as occurred, for instance, between Bavaltu and myself. Yet on another plane of experience, the plane of creative thought and imagination, the single communal attention could withdraw from this tissue of personal relationships. Instead, it concerned itself wholly with the exploration of the cosmos. With partial truth, it might be said that, while for love we were distinct, for knowledge, for wisdom, and for worship, we were identical. In the following chapters, which deal with the cosmical experiences of this communal I, it would be logically correct to refer to the exploring mind always in the singular, using the pronoun I, and saying simply, I did so and so, and thought so and so. Nevertheless, the pronoun we will still be generally employed so as to preserve the true impression of a communal experience, and to avoid the false impression that the explorer was just the human author of this book. Each one of us had lived his individual active life in one or other of the many worlds, and for each one individually, his own little blundering career in his remote native world retained a peculiar concreteness and glamour, like the vividness which mature men find in childhood memories. Not only so, but individually he imputed in his former private life an urgency and importance which, in his communal capacity, was overwhelmed by matters of great cosmical significance. This concreteness and glamour, this urgency and importance of each little private life, was of great moment to the communal I, in which each of us participated. It radiated the communal experience with its vividness and its pathos. For only in his own life, as a native in some world, had each of us actually fought, so to speak, in life's war as a private soldier at close grips with the enemy. It was the recollection of this fettered, imprisoned, blindfold, eager, private individuality that enabled us to watch the unfolding of cosmical events, not merely as a spectacle, but with a sense of the poignancy of every individual life as it flashed and vanished. Thus I, the Englishman, contributed to the communal mind my persistently vivid recollections of all my ineffectual conduct in my own troubled world, and the true significance of that blind human life redeemed by its little imperfect jewel of community, because apparent to me the communal I, with a lucidity which the Englishman in his primeval stupor could never attain and cannot now recapture. All that I can now remember is that as the communal I looked on my terrestrial career at once more critically and with less guilt than I do in the individual state, and on my partner in that career at once with clearer, colder understanding, our mutual impact, and with more generous affection. One aspect of the communal experience of the explorers I have still to mention. Each of us had originally set out upon the great adventure mainly in the hope of discovering what part was played by community in the cosmos as a whole. This question had yet to be answered, but meanwhile another question was becoming increasingly insistent. Our crowded experiences in the many worlds and our new lucidity of mind had bred in each of us a sharp conflict of intellect and feeling. Intellectually, the idea that some deity, distinct from the cosmos itself, had made the cosmos now seemed to us less and less credible. Intellectually, we had no doubt that the cosmos was self-sufficient, a system involving no logical ground and no creator. Yet increasingly, as a man may feel the psychical reality of a physically perceived beloved or a perceived enemy, we felt in the physical presence of the cosmos the psychical presence of that which we had named the Star Maker. In spite of intellect, we knew that the whole cosmos was infinitely less than the whole of being, and that the whole infinity of being underlay every moment of the cosmos. And with unreasoning passion, we strove constantly to peer behind each minute particular event in the cosmos to see the very features of that infinity which, for lack of a truer name, we had called the Star Maker. But, peer as we might, we found nothing, though in the whole and in each particular thing the dread presence indubitably confronted us. Its very infinity prevented us from assigning to it any features whatever. Sometimes we inclined to conceive it as sheer power and symbolized it to ourselves by means of all the myriad power deities of our many worlds. Sometimes we felt assured that it was pure reason, and that the cosmos was but an exercise of the divine mathematician. Sometimes love seemed to us its essential character, and we imagined it with the forms of all the Christs of all the worlds, the human Christs, the echinoderm and nautiloid Christs, the dual Christ of the symbiotes, the swarming Christ of the insectoids. But equally it appeared to us as unreasoning creativity, at once blind and subtle, tender and cruel, caring only to spawn and spawn the infinite variety of beings, conceiving here and there among 1,000 inanities a fragile loveliness. This it might for a while foster with maternal solicitude, till in a sudden jealousy of the excellence of its own creature it would destroy what it had made. But we knew well that all these fictions were very false. The felt presence of the Star Maker remained unintelligible, even though it increasingly illuminated the cosmos, like the splendor of the unseen sun at dawn. End of chapter 8. All right, so we took a break from visiting worlds to reflect on ourself as a traveler and the travelers that we are traveling with. And yeah. Again, there's like a discussion with collectivism, but also like shared experiences with a group. But how also experiences can be translated differently, even if you're looking at the same thing or going through the same thing. Like people experience them differently or interpret them differently. There was a little mention of now that we have traveled to these other places, we're able to look at our own experience with different eyes and a bit more critically, if that makes sense. And then they are still trying to find the Star Maker. And they have found that on each planet, they have their own version of like a creator, of a Christ. And they are finding that they're all false. It's all fiction. Like, it's not the Star Maker. And it's like, okay, well, maybe the cosmos just is. There was no creator. It just has always been that sort of thing. So we shall see. Okay, we are going to do this next chapter, but we will not finish it. I don't want to stop it because we still have so much time left. But it is a longer one, so I think we'll read like the first couple parts of it. But yeah, this is a longer one. It's almost 2 hours. Exactly. Now we're changing gears, which is nice. And we're pretty much like at the halfway point, so that rings true. So that's cool. And I'm wondering like with this last chapter of it being like an introspective almost, if how the worlds that we're seeing now are going to be reported differently or analyzed differently or commented on differently. I feel like it's too early. So we'll read a couple parts, and then we'll just finish the chapter next time, which is fine. I'm fine with it. As long as our book nerds out in the world are fine with it, then we'll do it. Something about this sweater, I keep getting snagged back here on this tag. All these little holes in here. They like to cling on. Cling on. Little sci-fi joke for you. That was totally accidental too, so that's cool. I know, in the Star Wars shirt too, I know. Blasphemy. All right. All right. Let's see how far we can get in this. Chapter 9. The Community of Worlds. Part 1. Busy Utopias. There came a time when our new-found communal mind attained such a degree of lucidity that it was able to maintain contact even with worlds that had passed far beyond the mentality of terrestrial man. Of these lofty experiences, I, who am once more reduced to the state of a mere individual human being, have only the most confused memory. Same. I am like one who, in the last extremity of mental fatigue, tries to recapture the more penetrating intuitions that he achieved in his lost freshness. He can recover only faint echoes and a vague glamour, but even the most fragmentary recollections of the cosmical experiences which befell me in that lucid state deserve recording. The sequence of events in the successfully waking world was generally more or less as follows. The starting point, it will be remembered, was a plight like that in which our own Earth now stands. The dialectic of the world's history had confronted the race with a problem with which the traditional mentality could never cope. The world's situation had grown too complex for lowly intelligences, and it demanded a degree of individual integrity in leaders and in led, such as was as yet possible only a few minds. Consciousness had already been violently awakened out of the primitive trance into a state of excruciating individualism, of poignant but pitifully restricted self-awareness. And individualism, together with the traditional tribal spirit, now threatened to wreck the world. Only after a long-drawn agony of economic distress and maniac warfare, haunted by an increasingly clear vision of a happier world, could the second stage of waking be achieved. In most cases, it was not achieved. Human nature, or its equivalent in the many worlds, could not change itself, and the environment could not remake it. But in a few worlds, the spirit reacted to its desperate plight with a miracle, or if the reader prefers, the environment miraculously refashioned the spirit. There occurred a widespread and almost sudden waking into a new lucidity of consciousness and a new integrity of will. To call this change miraculous is only to recognize that it could not have been scientifically predicted, even from the fullest possible knowledge of human nature, as manifested in the earlier age. To later generations, however, it appeared as no miracle, but as a belated awakening from an almost miraculous stupor into plain sanity. This unprecedented access of sanity took at first the form of a widespread passion for a new social order, which should be just and should embrace the whole planet. Such a social fervor was not, of course, entirely new. A small minority had long ago conceived it, and had haltingly tried to devote themselves to it. But now, at last, through the scourge of circumstance and the potency of the spirit itself, this social will became general. And while it was still passionate, and heroic action was still possible to the precariously awakened beings, the whole social structure of the world was reorganized, so that within a generation or two every individual on the planet could count upon the means of life and the opportunity to exercise his powers fully for his own delight and for the service of the world community. It was now possible to bring up the new generations to a sense that the world order was no alien tyranny, but an expression of the general will, and that they had indeed been born into a noble heritage, a thing for which it was good to live and suffer and die. To readers of this book, such a change may well seem miraculous, and such a state utopian. Those of us who had come from less fortunate planets found it at once a heartening and yet a bitter experience to watch world after world successfully emerge from a plight which seemed inescapable, to see a world population of frustrated and hate-poisoned creatures give place to one in which every individual was generously and shrewdly nurtured, and therefore not warped by unconscious envy and hate. Very soon, though no change had occurred in the biological stock, the new social environment produced a world population which might well have seemed to belong to a new species. In physique, in intelligence, in mental independence and social responsibility, the new individual far outstripped the old, as also in mental wholesomeness and in integrity of will. And though it was sometimes feared that the removal of all sources of grave mental conflict might deprive the mind of all stimulus to creative work and produce a mediocre population, it was soon found that, far from stagnating, the spirit of the race now passed on to discover new fields of struggle and triumph. The world population of aristocrats, which flourished after the Great Change, looked back with curiosity and incredulity into the preceding age, and found great difficulty in conceiving the tangled, disreputable, and mostly unwitting motives which were the mainsprings of action even in the most fortunate individuals among their ancestors. It was recognized that the whole pre-revolutionary population was afflicted with serious mental diseases, with endemic plagues of delusion and obsession due to mental malnutrition and poisoning. As psychological insight advanced, the same kind of interest was aroused by the old psychology as is awakened in modern Europeans by ancient maps, which distort the countries of the world almost beyond recognition. We were inclined to think of the psychological crisis of the waking worlds as being the difficult passage from adolescence to maturity, for in essence it was an outgrowing of juvenile interests, a discarding of toys and childish games, and a discovery of the interests of adult life. Tribal prestige, individual dominance, military glory, industrial triumphs lost their obsessive glamour, and instead, the happy creatures delighted in civilized social intercourse, in cultural activities, and in the common enterprise of world building. During the phase of history which followed the actual surmounting of the spiritual crisis in a waking world, the attention of the race was, of course, still chiefly occupied with social reconstruction. Many heroic tasks had to be undertaken. There was need not only for a new economic system, but for a new system of political organization, of world law, of education. In many cases, this period of reconstruction under the guidance of the new mentality was itself a time of serious conflict. For even beings who are sincerely in accord about the goal of social activity may disagree violently about the way. But such conflicts as arose, though heated, were a very different kind from the earlier conflicts, which were inspired by obsessive individualism and obsessive group hatreds. We noted that the new world orders were very diverse. This was, of course, to be expected, since biologically, psychologically, culturally, these worlds were very different. The perfected world order of an echinoderm race had, of course, to be different from that of the symbiotic ichthyoids and arachnoids, and this from that of a nautiloid world, and so on. But we noted also in all these victorious worlds a remarkable identity. For instance, in the loosest possible sense, all were communistic. For in all of them the means of production were communally owned, and no individual could control the labor of others for private profit. Again, in a sense, all these world orders were democratic, since the final sanction of policy was world opinion. But in many cases there was no democratic machinery, no legal channel for the expression of world opinion. Instead, a highly specialized bureaucracy or even a world dictator might carry out the business of organizing the world's activity with legally absolute power, but under constant supervision by popular will expressed through the radio. We were amazed to find that in a truly awakened world, even a dictatorship could be in essence democratic. We observed with incredulity situations in which the absolute world government, faced with some exceptionally momentous and doubtful matter of policy, had made urgent appeals for a formal democratic decision, only to receive from all regions the reply, "We cannot advise. We must decide as your professional experience suggests. We will abide by your decision." Law in these worlds was based on a very remarkable kind of sanction, which could not conceivably work successfully on Earth. There was never any attempt to enforce the law by violence, save against dangerous lunatics, such as sometimes occurred as throwbacks to an earlier age. In some worlds, there was a complex body of laws regulating the economic and social life of groups, and even the private affairs of individuals. It seemed to us at first that freedom had vanished from such worlds. But later we discovered that the whole intricate system was regarded as we should regard the rules of a game, or the canons of an art, or the innumerable extra-legal customs of any long-established society. In the main, everyone kept the law because he had faith in its social value as a guide to conduct. But if ever the law seemed inadequate, he would, without hesitation, break it. His conduct might cause offense or inconvenience or even serious hardship to his neighbors. They would probably protest vigorously. But there was never question of compulsion. If those concerned failed to persuade him that his behavior was socially harmful, his case might be tried by a sort of court of arbitration, backed by the prestige of the world government. If the decision went against the defendant, and yet he persisted in his illegal behavior, none would restrain him. But such was the power of public censure and social ostracism that disregard of the court's decision was very rare. The terrible sense of isolation acted on the lawbreaker like an ordeal of fire. If his motive was at bottom base, he would sooner or later collapse. But if his case had merely been misjudged, or if his conduct sprang from an intuition of value beyond the range of his fellows, he might persist in his course till he had won over the public. I mention these social curiosities only to give some illustration of the far-reaching difference between the spirit of these utopian worlds and the spirit which is familiar to readers of this book. It may be easily imagined that in our wanderings we came upon a wonderful diversity of customs and institutions. But I must not pause to describe even the most remarkable of them. I must be content to outline the activities of the typical waking worlds, so as to be able to press on to tell a story, not merely of particular worlds, but of our galaxy as a whole. Okay, so far, this chapter, since we've had our little introspection, we are now finding commonalities and differences, and so we're doing a little Venn diagram to see what's going on. And instead of speaking on a case-by-case basis, now we're going to go into about the galaxy as a whole and the truths, I guess, of this. When a waking world had passed through the phase of radical social reconstruction and had attained a new equilibrium, it would settle into a period of steady economic and cultural advancement. Mechanism, formerly a tyrant over body and mind, but now a faithful servant, would secure for every individual a fullness and diversity of life far beyond anything known to Earth. Exactly. Now we're cooking. Radio communication and rocket travel would afford to each mind intimate knowledge of every people. Labor-saving machinery would reduce the work of maintaining civilization. All mind-crippling drudgery would vanish, and the best energy of every one of the world's citizens would be freely devoted to social service that was not unworthy of a well-grown, intelligent being. and social service was apt to be interpreted very broadly. It seemed to permit many lives to be given over wholly to freakish and irresponsible self-expression. The community could well afford a vast amount of such wastage for the sake of the few invaluable jewels of originality which occasionally emerged from it. This stable and prosperous phase of the waking worlds, which we came to call the utopian phase, was probably the happiest of all the ages in the life of any world. Tragedy of one sort or another there would still be, but never widespread and futile distress. We remarked, moreover, that whereas in former ages tragedy had been commonly thought of in terms of physical pain and premature death, now it was conceived more readily as resulting from the clash and mutual yearning and mutual incompatibility of diverse personalities. So rare had the cruder kind of disaster become, and, on the other hand, so much more subtle and sensitive were the contacts between persons. Widespread physical tragedy, the suffering and annihilation of whole populations, such as we experience in war and plague, were quite unknown, save in those rare cases when a whole race was destroyed by astronomical accident, whether through loss of atmosphere, or the bursting of its planet, or the plunging of its solar system into some tract of gas or dust. In this happy phase, then, which might last for a few centuries or for many thousands of years, the whole energy of the world would be devoted to perfecting the world community and raising the caliber of the race by cultural and by eugenical means. Of the eugenical enterprise of these worlds I shall report little, because much of it would be unintelligible without a minute knowledge of the biological and biochemical nature of each of these non-human world populations. Oh. It is enough to say that the first task of the eugenists was to prevent the perpetuation of inheritable disease and malformation of body and mind. In days before the great psychological change, even this modest work had often led to serious abuses. Governments would attempt to breed out all those characters, such as independence of mind, which were distasteful to governments. Ignorant enthusiasts would advocate ruthless and misguided interference in the choice of mates, but in the more enlightened age these dangers were recognized and avoided. Even so, the eugenical venture did often lead to disaster. One splendid race of intelligent avians we saw reduced to the subhuman level by an attempt to extirpate susceptibility to a virulent mental disease. The liability to this disease happened to be genetically linked to an indirect manner with the possibility of formal brain development in the 5th generation. Of positive eugenical enterprises, I need only mention improvements of sensory range and acuity, chiefly in sight and touch, the invention of new senses, improvements in memory, in general intelligence, in temporal discrimination. These races came to distinguish ever more minute periods of duration, and at the same time to extend their temporal grasp as to apprehend ever longer periods as now. Many of the worlds at first devoted much energy to this kind of eugenical work, but later decided that, though it might afford them some new richness of experience, it must be postponed for the sake of more important matters. For instance, with the increasing complexity of life, it soon appeared very necessary to slow down the maturing of the individual mind, so as to enable it to assimilate its early experience more thoroughly. Before life begins, it said, there should be a lifetime of childhood. At the same time, efforts were made to prolong maturity to 2 or 4 times its normal extent and to reduce senility. In every world that had gained full eugenical power, there arose sooner or later a sharp public discussion as to the most suitable length of individual life. All were agreed that life must be prolonged, but while one party wished to multiply it only 3 or 4 times, another insisted that nothing less than 100 times the normal lifespan could afford the race that continuity and depth of experience which all saw to be desirable. Another party even advocated deathlessness and a permanent race of never-aging immortals. It was argued that the obvious danger of mental rigidity and the cessation of all advancement might be avoided by contriving that the permanent psychological state of the deathless population should be one of very early maturity. Different worlds found different solutions for this problem. Some races assigned to the individual a period no longer than 300 of our years. Others allowed him 50,000. One race of echinoderms decided on potential immortality, but endowed themselves with an ingenious psychological mechanism by which, if the ancient began to lose touch with changing conditions, he could not fail to recognize the fact, and would thereupon crave and practice euthanasia, gladly yielding his place to a successor of more modern type. Many other triumphs of eugenical experiment were we observed up and down the worlds. The general level of individual intelligence was, of course, raised far beyond the range of Homo sapiens, but also that superintelligence which can be attained only by a psychically unified community was greatly developed on the highest practicable plane, that of the conscious individuality of a whole world. This, of course, was impossible till the social cohesion of individuals within the world community had become as close-knit as the integration of the elements of a nervous system. It demanded also a very great advance of telepathy. Further, it was not possible till the great majority of individuals had reached a breadth of knowledge unknown on Earth. The last and most difficult power to be attained by these worlds in the course of their utopian phase was psychical freedom of time and space, the limited power to observe directly and even contribute to events remote from the spatio-temporal location of the observer. Throughout our exploration, we had been greatly perplexed by the fact that we, most of whom were beings of a very humble order, should have been able to achieve this freedom, which, as we now discovered, these highly developed worlds found so difficult to master. The explanation was now given us. No such venture as ours could have been undertaken by our unaided selves. Throughout our exploration, we had unwittingly been under the influence of a system of worlds which had attained this freedom only after eons of research. Not one step could we have taken without the constant support of those brilliant ichthyoids and arachnoid symbiotics who played a leading part in the history of our galaxy. They it was who controlled our whole adventure, so that we might report our experiences in our primitive native worlds. The freedom of space and time, the power of cosmical exploration and of influence by means of telepathic contact, was at once the most potent and the most dangerous asset of the fully awakened utopian worlds. Through the unwise exercise of it, many a glorious and single-minded race came to disaster. Sometimes the adventuring world mind failed to maintain its sanity in face of the welter of misery and despair that now flooded in upon it. telepathically from all the regions of the galaxy. Sometimes the sheer difficulty of comprehending the subtleties that were revealed to it flung it into a mental breakdown from which there was no recovery. Sometimes it became so enthralled by its telepathic adventures that it lost touch with its own life upon its native planet, so that the world community, deprived of its guiding communal mind, fell into disorder and decay, and the exploring mind itself died. That is the end of part 1 of chapter 9. Okay, interesting things, and always great conversation starters. So, if you could live forever, would you? But also, and that's assuming that, like, you are able-bodied, you're able to function the way that you are, currently. Your body is not rebelling against you. Your mind is not rebelling against you. Although with that, was it the echinoderms, one of the echinoderm communities, once somebody realized, because they opted for immortality, and once somebody realized that their mind was not as sharp, they had the option of no longer being. So I just think that's interesting. And also, like, I don't know if you've read Neil Shusterman, but he has a trilogy that has the idea that there is no longer natural death. Humans have just sort of surpassed it. And to prevent like overpopulation, we have scythes, and they're the ones who come and like make sure that there's no overpopulation, that sort of thing. Um, so like it's always an interesting thought because on the one hand, it's like, yeah, I would totally want to live for forever as long as I possibly could. But then also like it's like, okay, well, am I going to have the same like enjoyment? You know what I mean? It sounds, yeah, it sounds good to live as long as you want, right? Like no surprises, nothing unexpected. I think that'd be pretty cool. Hmm. So yeah, interesting conversations. And it's also interesting that like I have to keep reminding myself that like this book was written in 1937. I like had to pause for a minute and be like, when was it written? 1937. And like the same ideas, the same issues, the same commentary, it could be written today, Like some language tweaks, sure. The style of writing would probably be different, but it is pretty interesting. Totally. There would come a point when you're like, yeah, I'm done. I did what I did. I now know all of the languages. I have read all of the books that I could possibly want to read. I have traveled to all of the places. I'm good. It totally does have, yeah, this book definitely has a modern feel given the time. Yes. Yeah, you would have guessed it was the 60s. No, yeah, I know. It's wild. It's wild. Definitely ahead of its time for sure. I think. But I think that's where we're going to end it today on that fun little thought experience of, or experiment of, if you could live for forever, would you? So yes, that's going to be where we end. When next time, when next time we're doing this, next week, we will pick up right where we left off. So we'll still be in the midst of chapter 9. We'll just start at part 2. Ooh, an Orson Scott Card vibe. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Oh, what a great connection. That's great. Thanks for that. For sure, for sure. Man, I haven't thought of Orson Scott Card in a while. But yeah, you're totally right. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, now that you've like said this, I'm wondering how many authors have either deliberately been influenced by Star Maker or unknowingly have been influenced. Like, they're influenced by another author who was influenced by Star Maker. I'm curious. I'm sure there's no way for me to actually find out that information, but it's an interesting thought. So yes, that's gonna be it for today. Thank you all so much for being here. It was a good read. It was fun. I think he's known to. Yes. Okay. That totally makes sense. He's known to be influential. And you can totally see it too. Oh, his Wikipedia lists some big names. Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna have to look into that then. Yeah, thank you for that. Oh my gosh, no. Thank you for having me. So yes, I will see you all very soon. If not, I hope to see you even sooner. Um, as always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. Thank you all so, so much. Bye.